Welcome to the new sound of online radio. Welcome to the sound of Universal Broadcasting Network.
'Cause you make me feel like I've been locked out of hell.
A mix of today's hits and hard-to-find favorites, combined with the most entertaining and intriguing talk anywhere. This is your sound. This is the sound of Universal Broadcasting Network at UBNradio.com.
Stay that way because I like it like that.
Hello, and welcome to the Larry Yates As Is show. Larry is traveling this week, and this is Reverend Carolyn Wilkins, his partner in crime, partner in the studios, bringing you a program for today. A shout out to Larry and all the good work he's been doing. We've gotten lots of excellent reviews on this new series that he calls How Did We Get Here? And today I'm going to do my version of How Did We Get Here by talking about racial equality and justice. This was really inspired by yesterday's celebrations. As most of you know, it was the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It's not an easy day for many people because there's so many who believe that if he were able to have gone a further course in history, we might not be where we are today. But I'm one of those people that believes that we each have a destiny, we each have a purpose. And I know that he knew he fulfilled his purpose. In fact, the day before he was assassinated, you all know that he said, "I may not get there with you, but I know that these things will happen." So I want to begin by doing a quick overview of some of the things that Dr. King brought during his 13 years in ministry. I find that so amazing that all of this work came in a mere 13 years, although there were years of preparation. And many people have talked about King. Yesterday, there were a lot of programs on celebrations throughout the country. We're here in California, Los Angeles. There were programs here. And everyone had their own little way to talk about Dr. King. What we're going to do today is to look at his background, to look at the principles that he supported. Then we'll shift over to some of the things that were part of the dream that are no longer, that seem to still be a dream. Maybe you call it a nightmare now. But there are things that we still have to work on. And then we'll end by talking about where are we now. So how did we get here? Let's look at the legacy of Dr. King. He was an inspiring minister who spoke with such beauty and eloquence. He was inspired by his Christian faith as well as the peace teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. King led a nonviolent movement in the late 1950s and 60s to achieve legal equality for African Americans in the United States. I speak to people all over the world, and people all over the world know of his work, honor his work, and he and Nelson Mandela and Gandhi are considered pivotal in freedom movements around the world. What makes King unique also is the fact that while many people were advocating for civil rights during that time, most were looking at freedom by any means necessary, including violence. And Martin Luther King and the other two that I mentioned, Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, all used the power of words in acts of nonviolent resistance, such as protests, grassroots organizing, and civil disobedience, to achieve what may seem to be insurmountable goals. They were goals for freedom, access, equality. And he went on to lead many campaigns against poverty and even international conflict, but maintained his identity around nonviolence and the principles that men and women practice everywhere. He was intent on equality for men and women, regardless of color or creed, that all are equal members of the human family. To highlight a few of the things that he did accomplish in the years, he was first assigned to go work in the Montgomery bus boycott. And that was a boycott where there was a lot of work that was done ahead of time to prepare for it. And the Montgomery bus boycott was really the beginning of a lot of the boycotts that happened in the South. The next major achievement for Dr. King was he was elected the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, called SCLC. And that was very early in his career. He was in his early 30s. He then led a coalition of numerous civil rights groups. I want to emphasize that Dr. King went across all borders, across faith borders, across religious borders, across ethnic and racial borders. And while many people had lobbied for their own work, he was able to pull people together. In fact, one of his core principles that I'll speak of later is that no one is an enemy. He also led the March on Washington, a very powerful coming together of people, hundreds of thousands of people on the Mall in Washington. And regardless of how anybody spoke about the numbers, it was hard to even count how many people were there because people overflowed from the mall to the streets, to the parks, to everything in Washington, D.C. People came by bus, by car, by train, by foot. They came from all over the country. I know there were buses. At that time, I was living in New York City. There were buses from New York, from Ohio, the Midwest. There were freedom riders that came from California, Seattle, all over the country to support Dr. King and his message. A lot of people can have something to say, but there was something about his message that touched people in miraculous ways. The other thing that is so profound with Dr. King is in 1964, he was the youngest person ever to win a Nobel Peace Prize. He was awarded the Peace Prize for the work he had been doing. Now, there are a few others since that are younger than he is, but that was profound to have won the Peace Prize. That same year, Congress passed the landmark Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act. And I want to have you really look at this Because it's one thing to protest, it's one thing to march, it's another to disagree, but it's another thing to have a dream. And even more transformational is to gather the legislative backing that you need to create legislation, to create the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act provided equal access for people of all backgrounds, and then the Voting Rights Act was able to provide the opportunity for people to vote, of all people to vote. Now, shortly, we'll go back and look at how come some of those things aren't even working today. But I want to still highlight the effective leadership of a man that I call Dr. King. Now, history will go back and look at this in a different way, but something happened to Dr. King as he was doing all of this work. He became global and universal in his look at equality. And as he was looking outside of America between 1965 and 1968, Dr. King shifted his focus toward economic justice, which he highlighted in several campaigns starting in Chicago. And he moved toward international peace efforts. He became a champion, speaking out strongly against the Vietnam War. Now, this was a situation where Dr. King stood up to the warmongers, to the idea of being at war with Vietnam, and he wound up having conversations saying, why are we fighting people that look like us? Why are we fighting people who are just looking for their own rights, their own equality? Why are we going over there not only fighting, but taking napalm bombs and killing people? How is that just? And he brought that up. He became quite an enemy of the state by having that conversation about Vietnam and how the monies are being spent, how our war dollars and budget in the U.S. budget is being spent. And he also lobbied for peace, for international peace. The other area that I just mentioned that I know he was very controversial with was about economic justice, not just civil rights, but economic justice, because as soon as he opened that conversation, it meant he was speaking beyond just a racial issue, because poverty hits everyone. Poverty does not care whether you're black or white, whether you're born here or not. Poverty hits all races, all creeds, all colors, all backgrounds, all ethnicities. And when he started talking about economic justice in the U.S. and around the world, then that became a challenge. And he initiated in these years something that culminated into the Poor People's Campaign, which was a broad effort to assemble a multiracial coalition of impoverished Americans who could advocate for economic change. A lot of work was done in those 13 years. Conversation, boycotts, marches, all pivotal moments in America's history. There were legislative changes, and then finally a campaign that had marching all over the country. We're going to take a brief break, and we'll come back looking at nonviolent principles. so happy that you're joining us today. This is the Larry Yates Is Show with Reverend Carolyn Wilkins, and I'm speaking about the works of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the fact that we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of his assassination. More importantly, we're having conversation about the legacy that he left and where we are now. How did we get here? Racial equality and justice. So in this portion, I wanted to talk about the principles of nonviolence that Dr. King espoused. The first, and you can go on the King site. There is an institute and a museum in Atlanta that is his legacy. And there's information on that site for you to get more information about the details of his life. But the first idea of nonviolence is nonviolence means honoring the dignity and inherent worth of every human being. Now, that may not sound like it's all that important, but in America, when you look at our Constitution, I think many of you realize, but some of you may not realize that slaves were not considered whole beings. They were put on the books at a 3/5 position. We did not count as a whole person. So when we look at nonviolence, honoring the dignity and inherent worth of every whole human being, and that everyone should be counted as total and complete. Another idea around nonviolence means that our lives are all linked together. This is his idea of our interconnectivity and that what we do impacts the lives of other people. Therefore, we're responsible to and for each other. Now, that's a very different idea than what happens when people are angry with each other. The intent of getting your way means you sometimes have to step on other people. You have to get other people out of the way for you to gain what you're gaining. But these principles of nonviolence say we're all in this together and that our lives are linked in a way that what I do affects you and what you do affects me. We're responsible for and to each other. Another important principle is nonviolence means dedicating ourselves to guaranteeing the fundamental rights of every human being. And those are rights of justice, equity, and equality. Using our talents to empower others as well as ourselves. I want to repeat, justice, rights of justice, rights of equity and equality. We're going to shortly talk about where these rights are not being held up these days. And I'm not sure we always associate the inequalities that are happening in this country and around the world with where it fits in justice, equity, and equality. One of the other principles, nonviolence, is courageously choosing to practice compassion with our apparent adversaries. We oppose just injustice, not people. Now, I want to repeat this. This is probably one of the most important ones, principles of nonviolence. To choose to practice compassion with our apparent adversaries. Now, compassion does not mean that you forgive in a way that says they were not responsible. Compassion provides you the quality of being in the world that allows you to understand that others make mistakes, that you too make mistakes, and that you can have compassion for someone who did something that they should not have done. But it also encourages people to make retribution for the acts that they have done to hurt others. When there have been councils of reconciliation, that's part of the process, making sure that where you have a place of injustice and where people have done something that's an adversarial position, that they come back and are accountable for their actions. Now, this next sentence that says, we oppose injustice, not people. I know you're sometimes wondering right now, is that something we can do? Because there seem to be people in the administration right now, in today's administration, that we want to oppose because it doesn't seem like they get it. But what we still bring up when we talk about nonviolence is opposing their sense of injustice. And that's what's being shown in the administration, whether you're talking about the Department of Justice, you're talking about Homeland Security, or whether you're talking about the criminal system. Oppose the injustice, not the people, because the people can actually change. Another principle. Nonviolence means recognizing love as the power of the human spirit to triumph over injustice, social inequity, and suffering. Now, I know this isn't easy for most people, but we're talking about love in a different way. We're not talking about brotherly love, familial love, the love you have for people that are around you. We're talking about what he called agape love, which is unconditional love. And that love begins with the love that you have in your family, but it transcends to a place of love that you're able to step back. It's the kind of love that when you look in a child's eyes, you know that they are just there in their own purity, and whatever it is that they may be doing, they do it out of innocence. They do it out of maybe not knowing. And we forgive them and we have compassion if they may reach out and break our glasses or they run across a room and knock something over. We are compassionate and loving and caring with our children. So those are some of the principles, and one of the important principles that King talked about include the fact that we do not have enemies. No one is your adversary. There's a place for everyone at the table. And the other idea of nonviolence and his principle is come together at the table. Let us have a conversation. Let us talk. And even if we don't agree, let us move forward in our conversation. So I believe that those are principles that we can use regardless of whether we're talking about the specifics of problems in the criminal justice system or problems in our own home, in our schools. It helps to bring people together, to have conversations, and to discuss the challenges. I participated in a program called Days of Dialogue that I may have mentioned here before, and it's a program that brings educators, school children, and police officers together. And they have a chance to sit down in dialogue and go through a series of questions that ask about laws, that ask about reactions, what the responsibility of the police are. And what we often find in doing these programs, I've been doing them for about 5 years with the Institute for Nonviolence in Los Angeles, And what I find is that most people have never actually had a conversation with a police officer. They have been spoken to by a police officer. They may have been given direction. They may have been told to move out of the way. They may have been told to stop their car and show me your license, but they haven't had a conversation. They haven't had a way of talking to police officers to find out what are the parameters around how you arrest people. When do you pull your gun? How do you do these things? What makes you decide whether to take someone in, to stop them? When do you follow people? What is it that you do? And in these conversations, we have an amazing time of talking to police officers and young people, and they are able to share with us what their concerns are, the conversations their parents may have had with them about interacting with a police officer. And there is still a problem and a concern of when a black or brown young person is stopped by the police, what they have to go through, because they're told probably to assume the position or they're asked for their license, and the parents must share with them, or their guardians and people who have their greatest intention in mind, always remind them to not talk back, to do what you're asked to do, and to make sure your hands are in full view. I've heard this from many people. I have luckily not been confronted in ways that is adversarial, although I have been stopped by police. I've had police come to my house for silly things and had them react in ways that I didn't think they would react to my neighbors who were white in the same way. But we've all learned how to deal with the police in a positive way, and those who haven't are learning in a different way. And we're also reaching out to police officers so that they can view people in different ways, because they always say they are so proud to be sitting at the table with young people, with adults, and help them see themselves as human beings. It's all about how we interact with each other. And one of the things that happened, in fact, we were right here in Hollywood, and one of the officers sat and had the conversation, and we were with a specific group, the LGBTQ community, and they were explaining some of the concerns and issues they were going through and how they were harassed. And the police officer took their badge off and said, "I've had some of those same things happen to me. I've been gay and on the police force for 20 years, so I understand." And the people at the table shifted. Everything shifted when they understood that their situation, their way of living was understood. So coming to the table together is one of the things that's important and that Dr. King totally supported. I want to now go to a conversation about what ain't working, what's going on now, and if I have time, I may have conversations about other people. But what is not working is that dream. It seems like the dream has been denied because there's still issues of jobs, housing, the criminal justice system, immigration, and what is considered systemic oppression. We'll come back and address these after a brief break.
Like a fire of transformation.
This is our praying out song, Mark. You like this
breaking
song?
through my core.
Mark, you like that?
Shining in the darkness, I can see the light ablaze. And this new territory is my strength, it is my way. Say said this new territory is my strength, and now I pray, well I pray that you see the best of life, the best of love, the very best of it. Yes, I pray that you see the best of life, the best of love, the very best of everything. Wake up and see the best of life, yes, the best of love, the very best of everything. Wake up and see the best of life, the best of love, the very best of everything. Say yes, see the best of life, the best of love, the very best of everything. See the best of life, the best of I pray that you see the best of life, the best of love, the very best of
We're back. This is the Larry Yates Is Is show again. Reverend Carolyn Wilkins stepping in the big shoes of Larry Yates. And our topic today is How Did We Get There? A conversation on racial equality and justice. We spent a few minutes talking about the legacy of Dr. King, the 50th anniversary of his assassination, and we also looked at some of the principles of nonviolence. I want to take this last segment and discuss some of these areas that we still need help in. There still needs to be a conversation around how did we get here, racial equality and justice. So one of the areas that we talk about are jobs. There's not only a lack of jobs from the time that in the 60s where there was abundance of blue-collar jobs that people from the South could go to. It's how migration happened to major cities like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, was people moving from one place to the other to find jobs, to get paid and send money back to the families. It's what many black fathers did who left home. Right now, though, in so many cities, there's a high unemployment, especially in the black community. And there's also a lack of jobs that people can have who have general skills. There are places like grocery stores that people can work in, and regular jobs for the city and state and county. But jobs that have decent wages like they had in the auto industry are becoming fewer and far between. Although I will applaud the auto industry for bringing work back to some major cities and areas. There's also a discrepancy still in the wages of whites versus African Americans. There's a discrepancy in males versus females. And that's something that still has to be worked on for equity and equality of pay. Another area is housing. The cost of living in around the country is going up significantly. And where new companies come in, you often have people who are moving out. I know major cities where people who have been living in apartment buildings for years are being put out because the landlords are either changing them to Airbnb or they're making them into condos or other high-end housing with rates that people cannot afford. If you're making minimum wage, you probably can't live in some cities like downtown LA and downtown New York City and Chicago, where they're being returned. People are moving from the suburbs back to the city because they don't want to commute. And the younger people do not want to commute. They want to be in the midst of things that are happening. So there's an increase in homelessness because the working poor is a real thing. People have minimum wage jobs, but they're still not able to keep up. So this is something I know King would be active in and encourages people right now to be active in looking at housing. And the homelessness challenge is one that we see here in Los Angeles. California, I believe, has the largest number of homeless people in this country. Many of them are in LA because of the ability to stay warm and the difference in the temperatures, as well as people being able to have services provided in a better way than other areas. But the number of homeless has increased so dramatically that Los Angeles has not been able to keep up with the demand. So shelters are filled, overnight places to stay are filled, and they are doing amazing work with the county supervisors, and Mayor Garcetti are doing great things to look at building housing, but it's not keeping up with the demand. So we would look at this as a moral dilemma of why is there homelessness? When you go back 40, 50 years, those of you who are old enough to think back, you never really saw homelessness. There may have been someone who didn't go home after being out all night drinking or at a party or doing something, but there were not people who were homeless in the street. People had a place to go, families took them in, or there were places for them to stay. So this is a moral dilemma that we must look at, and in the legacy of Dr. King, each one reach out and do something. The area that I want to look at, which is probably going to be another show, is about jails and our law enforcement, the war on drugs, the 3-strike laws, and what has happened with the overcrowding of jails and the number of prisoners who outnumber the percentage of their representation in the population. Over 60% of inmates in most of the prison systems are black and brown people, and it's probably higher than that now. And as a result of that, it's really being considered the newest form of slavery because people in jail wind up doing work for companies at ridiculously low wages. But more importantly, it's taking the male experience from families. They're children who've had their fathers and brothers in jail for years, that they didn't get to have the experience of them being there. And they could be for minor crimes. They could be for situations that people did not have the proper legal representation, because a public defender has thousands of cases, and even though their heart may be in the right place, they're not able to do all the research and the finding ways to make a difference to get somebody off if they're not guilty. So we want to look at the legal system, the criminal justice system, and make sure that justice is part of what we move forward to and not just the criminalization of people. Right now, the current person in the White House has just sent troops to mitigate immigration. They're wanting to build walls. I grew up at a time that taking walls down was what was considered the right thing to do, to have people have free access from different parts of the world. And we're talking about building a wall. I still cannot even imagine why that's something we contemplate, to build a wall between the United States and Mexico. And today, troops were assigned, the military was assigned to go and protect the wall, although they will not be able to arrest people, at least at this point. But immigration is an opportunity. It is a place for us to do the right thing, to make sure there are immigration laws and to handle them properly. Right now, it's a land of the privileged. America used to be a land of the free. And I'm not sure when all of that changed, because almost everyone who's here, if you're not Native American, migrated to this country. Some came by choice, some came in chains. The last thing I want to look at is, where did this dream go for equality of opportunity? And so many people will point to the fact that that there was a Black man elected to the White House. And I applaud President Barack Obama for all that he did, for the dignity that he carried in the office, the level of authority and knowledge that he presented in the office, and his thoughtfulness in being in the office. What he carried with him, he didn't get everything done, I do admit that. And there are people in the African American community that feels he could have done more. But you also see that he had Republican Congress, and they stopped him in everything he was trying to do. And now the current 45 seems to be systematically taking away every bill, everything that Obama put in place for the good of the country, just because. And it feels very racist that some of the things that Obama put in place, including DACA, are being pulled down, are being taken down. How did we get here? We got here because some of the people in this listening audience did not stand up, because some of the people have fought for equality and justice and civil rights, and there still were times of racial inequality, racism, challenges in housing, and people did not stand up to do the right thing. So where do we go from here? I'm not one that spends a lot of time on blame, but I spend time on vision, dreams, and possibilities. The possibility is that we stand up together, that we create laws that are effective together, that we have the victories that Martin Luther King talked about for American democracy. It's not just for Black people. It is for America. The things that he brought to the plate influenced everyone. The civil rights movement had an impact on the women's movement, had an impact on the Hispanic movement, has an impact on the movement of those who have medical challenges, and it also impacted the LGBTQ community. Martin Luther King planted seeds and started the tree of liberty. I hope you all will really take a moment and be at a place of honoring, respecting, and knowing that the work is not over. We have an opportunity and obligation to make sure that the budget isn't so lopsided that money goes to military, police, and building walls and not to human services. We want to make sure that we speak to our local Congress people, our local council people, and ensure that they're making decisions that feed people, that provide health care for people, and provide fair housing for people. How can you make a difference? You can make a difference by writing letters to editors. You can go see local politicians, have conversations with them, and bring groups of people together that say, this is what we want in our community. Stand for something and not just complain. I went to a gathering at City Hall several weeks ago, and I had a very interesting situation that I went through. I was on the way to the gathering to be a part of it, and it was a boycott and a protest. It was actually a protest movement for street vendors, and I was going to be a speaker at this protest movement. And I wound up crossing the street with a gentleman who I believe worked in City Hall. And he whispered to me, "Oh no, another demonstration," as we were walking across the street because the demonstrators were on the other side. And I said, "Oh really? What's wrong with demonstrations?" He said, "Well, they just get in the way and there are just too many of them." And my comment to him was, people are making strategic decisions about life matters when they're demonstrating. And that I believe that the people who are out here today are doing it for a good cause. And he looked at me and he said, "Yeah, but I just hear everybody complaining all the time." And I told him that he was right. There are a lot of people that complain, but only a small percentage take the time to protest, to formally protest, to speak to their council people, to stand up with people, to make signs, to gather, and to have a cause that you're for. Most people spend their time complaining about what we don't have or complaining about people who you think are taking your rights from you. So I encourage you all to stand up, have a voice, make sure that you are speaking on behalf of the greatness of this country. I have a dream. Dr. King had a dream. And what we both know is that this country stands for something great. It stood for a place that brought people from all over the world together. This is a nation built of people from all nations around the world. And we've come together to live together, to be at peace together, and to grow together. We've become an amazing nation. but we have some things that we need to stand up for. And I hope you'll be one of the ones that says, I have a dream. I stand for the good. I stand for justice, equality, and equity. And I know that I'm going to do something in my own neighborhood to make sure the homeless are housed, the hungry are fed, and the children are taken care of. This is Reverend Carolyn Wilkins. I'm so glad we had this time together. I honor Dr. King. I honor his words, his work, and his legend. And I know that there are many things that he has said, but the thing that I love the most that he says is love is how you have freedom, that you stand behind love, and you cannot change. Hatred cannot change hatred. Only love can make a friend of someone who's filled with hatred. So I leave you with that. I leave you with a sense of love and compassion, justice and equality. And let us have that lens that we look at the world. And let us elect officials who have that same lens. I end this with a sense of peace and joy. And shout out to Larry again. Continue this wonderful conversation about how did we get here. And the next conversation will be, how do we make a change?